Hello, welcome to VirtuEL 2020. I'm MVanBalkom from BC, Canada, and this is Raising Their Voices. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you for Tan and Carol for letting me join. I have been teaching English language learners for 20 years, first in South Korea, and then back in Canada. Currently, I'm the ELL program consultant for the Burnaby School District in Main Metro Vancouver. In Burnaby, we have about 12,000 ELL students, broken into 4 approximate groups. We have Canadian citizens who speak another language other than French or English at home. We have immigrants, including refugees from places like Syria and Afghanistan. We have exchange students who come for a year or less, and international students who are planning to graduate from a Canadian university. They come from all over the world, but some of our main languages are Mandarin, Korean, Arabic, Farsi, Vietnamese, and Hindi. Recently, we've had an influx of Spanish speakers from South and Central America. In British Columbia, we always start with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous people. And thus, I want to thank and acknowledge the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, on whose traditional unceded territories I teach, learn, and live. I've included here a picture of the top of Burnaby Mountain, which is about 5 minutes from my house. I recognize the privilege of living in such a beautiful land that fulfills my physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. I want to encourage you to take a moment and think about the place where you are and the Indigenous people that have lived there since time immemorial. We know more than ever, we need to hear our students' voices, especially our students of color. We need to hear their stories because we need to have them help us break the white narrative that is so often the only story told. Often we segregate our ELL students in a way to protect them, but we're doing them a disservice. We're doing a disservice to them, to our schools, and to our communities. They need to be seen and heard. In the last few years, I've worked to make heritage languages visible in my schools. We make these posters and post them throughout the school community so that everyone, visitors, teachers, and students can see them. What we know is that people walk by and they try to say the words and they read the posters, and that we can hear them in our classes, and our students sit up taller and prouder. They also teach their friends and classmates how to say hello in their languages. The objective we will be discussing today is we will use non-linear text to encourage students to write their own stories. To give you some background into BC education, ELL students were seen from a deficit lens. And as such, courses and curriculum were created for that. However, a work group that I was really honored to be part of sought to change it. We wanted to come from a strength-based position and be open to any multilingual speaker, including native English speakers who were learning another language like French, Spanish, Japanese. This course would improve academic reading, writing, listening, and speaking skills, but we wanted teachers and students to see that multilingual, multicultural students have a superpower, and that superpower will assist and not hinder their academic journey. We called this class Cultural Empowerment Through Language, or CEL for short. I had the honor of being one of the first people in our district to teach this class. It was a great group of kids, very culturally diverse. There were about 8 different languages spoken. After 2 months of working with these students, I realized their strengths were being able to say their opinion and being empathetic to other perspectives. I want to build on that, as well as work on inference and figurative language. I also wanted to give them a project that had real world purpose. So I explained that I would use their texts to teach reading and reading skills to newcomer students in the future. I wanted to collect as many stories in as many languages as I could. And this really motivated students because they were able to help kids in a way that they wish they had been helped at the beginning of their English journeys. The content and language objective I shared with my students was we will practice inference and figurative language by reading texts and writing dual language vignettes. So I use literature circles with my in-person class, but you could do this in a hybrid or remote learning classroom. You could choose one text and to do as a novel study. I use The Yellow Pear by Gu Zhang as my mentor text. The Yellow Pear tells the story of the author's immigration to Burnaby, BC from China. I really love this story because it is set in our exact place in the world. And so all my students can relate to it no matter where they're from. Students then could choose one of 4 texts to read for their literature circle. They could choose The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It tells the story of a young Latina immigrant to the United States. Seed Folks, which uses very many narrators from different ethnicities to tell its story. Rue by Kim Thu, which is the author's poetic memoirs on being a refugee from Vietnam to Montreal, Canada. And Richard Wagamese, an Ojibwe author, his story is One Story, One Song, and it tells about the successes and struggles of his life. All of these stories, except for The Yellow Pear, have audiobooks. And The House on Mango Street and Seed Folks even have free audiobooks on YouTube. I also have thought that it would be really great to create my own audiobooks of them, or even better, maybe have students create those audiobooks. Because these texts can be broken very easily into shorter pieces that work separately or as a whole, they're not really overwhelming to students. Plus, they have a variety of reading levels. I was very conscious of choosing minority voices to amplify in these texts. I wanted there to be texts where students could see themselves reflected. If we want students to be vulnerable and risk telling their stories, they need to see that others have done it before them. I started every class looking at a chapter of The Yellow Pear. As you can see, the vignettes are very short and include a Chinese translation and an image. While this text is short, it is full of meaning and figurative language, such as metaphors and allusions. We would read this text together, and then we would explode it. I would have certain areas that I nudged the direction into, but mostly students would dissect the language by themselves. For example, they said that the pear was in a metaphor for experience, and that when you bite into the pear, it is having that experience. They discussed the allusions to Chairman Mao and the Cultural Revolution. This was really interesting because I had students from Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Taiwan, and mainland China, and they all have different views on these historic events and person. They further discuss culture shock, which they all had experienced in some form or another. And then they decided that the fruit was symbols of hope. By doing this exploding passage strategy, students were looking and playing with the words on the page, but also in between the lines. For the most part, I stayed out of the conversation and let them figure it out. I would post, if I was teaching remotely, I would post this at the beginning of the week and have students comment it and respond to each other. And then I might film a short instructional video on Stringcastify to tease out any ideas that maybe weren't said that I wanted to highlight. I'm not familiar with Flipgrid yet, but I believe that application would also work really well here for asynchronous learning. Students then went from the class discussion into literature circle groups. I use Faye Brownlee's Say Anything model from her Grand Conversations and Thoughtful Responses, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. Faye is also responsible for showing me the exploding passage strategy that I showed you last slide. In these I gave students booklets that had headings of figurative devices that I wanted to, focus on, like imagery and symbolism. But I didn't give them roles per se, as we may have done in traditional literature circles. Students had to meet together with their groups, usually about 4 or 5 people, and they had to pick one idea to start that was in their notes or that they had just thought of. And they would tell their group, and then everybody in the group had to respond to what the person said. There are no passes, but I would give them sentence frames, which would be on my walls or on bookmarks. In a virtual classroom, I would have these on our digital classroom platform like Google Classroom or Teams, so that they could look at that to help them speak. The one rule I have is that when I am with them, I am a ghost. So whether that's virtual or an in-person, they are not to engage with me. And this is really hard for me because their conversations are so interesting that I want to jump in and give my opinion. However, as soon as I do that, and which I have done many times, even though I tell myself not to, the conversation becomes all about me and it centers around what I think. So instead, I take notes and I look for opportunities for mini lessons further in the week. I use a lot of ideas from mini lessons for literature circles by Harvey Daniels and Nancy Steineck. After each lit circle, the next class becomes a writing class. Students could use the literary device they learned about in Yellow Pear or the theme, or something that they read in their lit circle book, or something else. I encourage students to look for defining moments in their lives. One provocation was to go to their social media accounts and look for a picture that told a story and then put words to it. They quickly learned that it is much harder to write less than to write more. In this excerpt by Kiat Gian called Chinese Noodles, he is discussing his aunt's noodles that she would make him every day for breakfast before he went to school in Vietnam. He quite naturally uses imagery and nostalgia to build the emotion of his piece. Students would spend the class writing and they can ask me questions or get feedback from me. However, with remote learning, they don't all have to write at the same time, especially if they're not feeling it because it's the end of the day or the beginning of the day, just after lunch, and they can fit it into their own schedules. I have access to all their documents, and so it makes the writing process a lot more dynamic. Unfortunately, Microsoft does not know how to do dual language, or maybe it does, but I do not know. So if you do, tweet at me and let me know how to do it. But students could write in either language. They could write in English or another language. Wherever the emotions and words were coming from, they were encouraged to follow. In this vignette by Vanessa Kasenko, called Top of the Mountain, she writes about her connection to nature. When students were close to publishing, they would write the translation in whatever language they needed. So some needed to write the English translation, some needed to write another language translation. Again, I have access to the documents and I'm giving feedback constantly. Many students realized that their ideas could not be transferred one-to-one because of the amount of inference that they used. So they had to look at both cultures very closely to think about how to make their ideas similar. and really powerful words began to emerge. In this passage, Syria by Misam Al-Abbas, she discusses being in her home country of Syria during the war. And I'm just going to read the first sentence. I am the girl who is woken up from a nightmare, then found my city colored with blood. So powerful and so heartbreaking at the same time. Students were encouraged, in fact, they were required to have a visual because vignettes are often described as snapshots with words. And so I thought it was very important for them to be able to find an image that matched the emotion of their piece. Many of them started with the image and then wrote about it, but others went and found one from their personal sites or from the internet that matched their feelings. I think this is really important because it encouraged artistic interpretations and worked on those critical and creative thinking skills. We also looked at Humans of New York quite a bit, which is an Instagram account that I highly recommend if you get a chance. It's a great learning tool. And you can see here an example by Claudia Wan in her Chinese model. She's used a personal picture from her social media as her illustration. Because they did such a great job, and because we wanted those voices to be seen, I had them choose one of the 3 vignettes that they had written that month for the Words writing project. This is an anthology that my district publishes every year of K-12 writing from their students. First of all, I think that's a great idea because, again, we need real life purpose. And this helped motivate students' competitive natures. They want their stories to be told, and they want them to be told to people outside of their bubble. This is one that was decided to be published by the committee. It's called Gratefulness by Tran Thien Kim Nguyen, and it's about how simple things make life meaningful. And as far as I know, this is the first Vietnamese text ever to be highlighted in this anthology. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that I've sparked some ideas about how you could raise the voices of your students in your community. Please follow me on Twitter or Instagram. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Have a great day.